On a damp Tuesday morning in April 1984, the chain-link fence behind the abandoned Miller Brewing Company grain transfer yard in Dodge County, Wisconsin, disappeared beneath another steaming mountain of spent barley. A rusted dump truck backed into place, raised its bed with a loud hydraulic groan, and unloaded nearly 12 tons of warm brewery grain onto the same forgotten strip of land where it had done the same thing every weekday for almost 2 years. The driver signed his paperwork, wiped his hands on a red shop rag, and drove away without looking back. Standing only 30 yards away, a 12-year-old girl counted every load. She never missed one. The neighbors thought she was wasting her afternoons. The factory manager believed the grain would rot before anyone found a use for it. Even the county inspector had written the property off as little more than a neglected corner bordering an aging dairy farm outside the town of Juneau. Only one person looked at those smoking piles of barley and quietly whispered, "That's tomorrow's feed." That man was Walter Jensen, 71 years old, a dairy farmer whose hands carried 48 Wisconsin winters inside their cracked skin. His boots had crossed the same field since the late 1930s. His back bent a little more every spring, but he still walked every fence line before sunrise, never hurrying, never complaining. The girl beside him was his granddaughter, Emily. She listened far more than she spoke. Walter liked that. "Most people hear noise," he once told her while repairing an old gate. "Farmers listen for patterns." Emily never forgot those words. Let me tell you about Walter Jensen. He bought nothing unless he believed it would outlive him. His barn still sheltered a 1953 Farmel Super M, a machine rated at roughly 44 drawbar horsepower that his late wife, Ruth, insisted they could barely afford when they purchased it secondhand in 1961 for $2,350. Walter maintained every grease fitting himself. Every 50 operating hours, he changed what needed changing, tightened what needed tightening, and wrote the date inside a weathered notebook that never left the farmhouse kitchen. People joked that the tractor was older than half the county. Walter usually smiled. Then he climbed onto the steel seat, turned the ignition, and let the engine answer for him. Across the road, things looked very different. A young agricultural consultant named Daniel Brooks had recently arrived from Madison. 32 years old, college-educated, confident, and ambitious. He had built his reputation on modern efficiency, computers, feed optimization, chemical analysis, and expansion plans filled every conversation he had. When someone mentioned Walter Jensen's habit of collecting discarded brewery grain, Daniel laughed. "You can't build a future on leftovers," he said loudly enough for everyone gathered inside the Juneau Cooperative Feed Store to hear. Several men chuckled. One laughed harder than the rest. Walter happened to be standing near the seed counter, buying fence staples. He looked toward Daniel. His face never changed. "I suppose we'll find out," Walter replied. Nothing more. No anger. No argument. He paid his bill, tipped his cap to the cashier, and walked back to his pickup. That quiet answer lingered far longer than the laughter. The brewery grain itself had a history few people understood. Every batch of beer left behind enormous quantities of spent barley rich in protein and fiber. Most factories considered it a disposal problem. Transporting it to landfills cost money. Giving it away cost almost nothing. Walter understood something the accountants did not. Waste depended entirely on who was looking at it. Every afternoon, Emily helped spread fresh loads across a packed gravel pad behind the barn before mixing portions with chopped hay, corn silage, and mineral supplements for their Holstein herd. The cows loved it. Milk production slowly climbed. Feed costs quietly fell. Nobody outside the farm noticed. Yet, let me tell you about Emily. Most children her age collected baseball cards or comic books. Emily collected numbers. She recorded every truck arrival, every estimated weight, every feeding ratio, every milk check, every veterinary expense. She filled spiral notebooks with careful handwriting that looked far older than 12 years. Walter never asked her to do it. She simply understood that memory was easier to trust when it lived on paper. By the autumn of 1984, something unusual began appearing inside those notebooks. Each month ended with a little more money than the one before. Not much, just enough to matter. Walter never celebrated small victories. He believed success grew quietly, the same way corn pushed upward beneath the soil before anyone saw green leaves. Late one October afternoon, Emily noticed an unfamiliar pickup truck parked beside the brewery fence. 3 men wearing company jackets stood beside the grain piles, pointing toward Walter's property. One carried a clipboard. Another held a camera. The third never stopped watching the old farmer crossing the pasture. Walter shut off the engine. He removed his gloves. Then he said something so calmly that Emily would remember it for the rest of her life. And before the sun disappeared behind the oaks that evening, those strangers made an offer that would change everything. Walter looked at the 3 men without saying a word. The oldest of them stepped forward first, extending a hand that carried more confidence than warmth. "My name is Richard Coleman," he said, operations supervisor at the brewery. Walter shook his hand once. Firm, calm, nothing more. Richard glanced toward the endless piles of spent grain beyond the fence. "We've been reviewing disposal costs. Someone told us you've taken nearly every load we've dumped here for the last 2 years. Walter nodded. "Most of them." Richard smiled. "We honestly thought it was being wasted." Walter looked across his pasture, where 40 Holstein cows were feeding quietly. "It isn't." Emily noticed something unusual. For the first time since the conversation began, Richard stopped talking. He simply watched the cattle. Their coats were glossy. Their weight looked excellent. Even their movement seemed calm. Everything about the herd reflected careful management. A younger man standing beside Richard opened his clipboard. "Our records show your milk production has increased nearly 19% since 1982. Walter looked surprised. "You've been watching?" Richard answered honestly. "We started last month." The third visitor finally spoke. "I'm Charles Myers, financial controller." His voice carried the confidence of someone who trusted spreadsheets more than people. "We're spending nearly $200,000 every year hauling brewery grain to landfills across southern Wisconsin." Walter waited. Charles continued. "If there's value in it, we'd rather know." Emily watched her grandfather remove his cap. He scratched the weathered brim with one finger before speaking. "You already knew there was value." The 3 visitors looked confused. Walter continued. "You just measured the wrong thing." Silence settled between them. Even Richard couldn't argue with that. "Let me tell you about spent brewery grain. Most people hear the word waste and imagine something useless. But after barley finishes the brewing process, much of its protein, digestible fiber, and energy remain. Fresh spent grain spoils quickly if ignored, which is why breweries often pay to haul it away. Farmers living nearby sometimes collected it for livestock feed, but only if they understood how to store it properly and balance it with hay, corn silage, and minerals. Used wisely, it could reduce feed costs without sacrificing animal health. Used carelessly, it could become moldy within days. The grain wasn't valuable because it was free. It was valuable because someone understood it. Walter understood it. That was the difference. Richard folded his clipboard. "What if we delivered directly to your farm?" Walter smiled faintly. "What happens when I can't use it all?" The brewery men exchanged uncertain looks. Emily answered before anyone else could. "We'll help other farms." Everyone turned toward the 12-year-old. Richard laughed softly. "You've already thought about that?" She nodded. "For months." Walter looked at his granddaughter with quiet pride. He never interrupted her. She deserved to be heard. News of the meeting spread quickly across Dodge County. Within days, everyone at the Juneau Cooperative Feed Store had an opinion. Some admired Walter. Most doubted him. Daniel Brooks doubted him the loudest. "You really think one little girl is going to organize half the county?" He laughed. Several customers laughed with him. One slapped the counter. Another nearly spilled his coffee. Daniel pointed toward the window where Walter's old pickup sat outside. "Maybe next she'll tell us that rusty farmer is worth more than a brand new tractor." More laughter. Louder this time. Walter happened to be walking to the front door, carrying a small box of spark plugs. Every conversation stopped. Daniel smiled awkwardly but didn't apologize. Walter walked straight toward the parts counter, bought exactly what he came for, then turned toward Daniel. "If you're finished laughing," Walter said quietly, "I've got work to do." No anger, no insult, just simple truth. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Daniel watched the old farmer leave. For reasons he couldn't explain, the laughter no longer sounded funny. Have you ever known you were right, while everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Not because you were louder, not because you had better arguments, but because experience had already shown you something they hadn't lived long enough to see. Most people never forget that feeling. Neither did Walter. By January 1985, Emily's notebooks had grown into ledgers. Every truckload entering the farm was recorded. Every neighboring farmer receiving grain signed a receipt. Every feeding schedule was documented. She wasn't building homework. She was building a business, without realizing it. Richard Coleman returned almost every Friday afternoon. At first, he came to inspect deliveries. Then he came to ask questions. Eventually, he came simply to learn. One snowy evening, he stood beside Walter inside the machinery shed. The old 1953 Farmel Super M rested quietly beneath a hanging light bulb. Richard ran his hand across the faded red hood. You've kept this thing alive longer than some companies stay in business. Walter smiled. It isn't a lie because it's old. Richard looked at him. It's a lie because nobody skipped the little jobs. Richard never forgot that sentence. Years later, he would repeat it during board meetings. Not about tractors, about people. Outside, Emily watched another brewery truck disappear down the county road. She noticed something different. The truck wasn't empty. It carried paperwork, official paperwork, and every page had her grandfather's name written across the top. She didn't know it yet, but before spring planting began, those papers would place the Jensen family at the center of the biggest agricultural partnership Dodge County had seen in decades. By the first week of March 1985, the handshake between Walter Jensen and the brewery had become something far bigger than anyone expected. What began as a simple arrangement to collect unwanted grain was now a formal agreement. The brewery would deliver every usable load within a 30-mile radius directly to Walter's farm. In return, Walter and Emily would organize distribution to neighboring livestock farms before the grain spoiled. People who had laughed only months earlier suddenly wanted to know how it worked. Walter answered every question, patiently, without boasting, without reminding anyone they had doubted him. Emily turned the old machine shed into a tiny office, a second-hand desk, a rotary telephone purchased for $48, county maps pinned to the wall, and stacks of handwritten ledgers became the headquarters of an operation nobody had planned. Every delivery was timed. Every farm had a schedule. Every load was accounted for. Soon, nearly 20 dairy farms depended on those deliveries every week. The brewery saved thousands of dollars in disposal costs. The farmers saved thousands in feed expenses. And Emily noticed something even more important. Nobody called the grain waste anymore. Let me tell you about the 1953 Farmel Super M one more time. Most people judge an old tractor by its paint. Walter judged it by its sound. He could tell whether the carburetor needed adjustment before anyone else heard the engine stumble. He knew when a bearing wanted grease simply by placing one weathered hand against the transmission housing after a long day's work. Machines speak. Most people just don't learn their language. The Super M had hauled hay, pulled wagons, powered augers, and carried generations through good harvests and bad ones. Its original owner had traded it in during 1961, believing newer machines would replace everything it represented. He wasn't entirely wrong. Modern tractors were stronger, faster, more comfortable, but none of them carried Walter's memories. That tractor had been beside him the day Emily's grandmother planted her final garden. It had cleared snow the winter Emily was born. It had never missed a season. Not one. Daniel Brooks watched all of this with growing frustration. His consulting business had promised efficiency through expensive feed programs and commercial contracts. Now farmers were quietly reducing costs using a system built around something factories had once paid to throw away. His pride hurt more than his finances. One afternoon he drove onto Walter's farm carrying a folder thick with charts. "I'd like to understand what you built," he admitted. Walter invited him inside. Coffee was poured. No mention was made of the laughter at the feed store. Daniel finally spoke. I thought I knew farming. Walter stirred his coffee. You know numbers. Daniel looked confused. Walter continued. Now you're learning people. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Sometimes silence teaches faster than conversation. Have you ever discovered that the biggest lesson in your life came from the very person you underestimated? It's uncomfortable, sometimes embarrassing, but those moments often change us more than our greatest successes ever could. Daniel was beginning to understand that. As spring arrived, more breweries from neighboring counties contacted Walter. Some wanted advice. Others wanted contracts. Emily spread new maps across the kitchen table. Green pins marked farms. Blue pins marked breweries. Red strings connected routes that stretched farther every month. Walter smiled. What are you building? Emily answered without looking up. A network. Walter laughed quietly. No. She looked at him. A community. She smiled. He was right. Again, late in May, disaster nearly erased everything they had built. 3 straight days of heavy rain turned the county roads into mud. One fully loaded grain truck slid into a drainage ditch less than 5 miles from the Jensen farm. The driver escaped unharmed. The truck did not. Nearly 15 tons of fresh grain sat stranded. If it remained there until morning, it would spoil. Richard Coleman arrived within an hour. So did Daniel Brooks. County workers shook their heads. We'll need a heavy wrecker. Not until tomorrow. The road won't hold tonight. Richard looked at Walter. What do we do? Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the machinery shed. Emily already knew what he was thinking. She rolled open the wide wooden doors. The old Farmel Super M sat exactly where it always had. Daniel frowned. You're not serious. Richard looked uncertain. The truck weighs over 20,000 pounds. Daniel laughed. Not cruelly this time. More from disbelief than arrogance. That old tractor doesn't stand a chance. Walter climbed onto the steel seat. The familiar engine fired after only 2 turns. Its steady rhythm echoed across the yard. Walter eased the tractor toward the road. Every neighbor watching knew the numbers. A Farmel Super M wasn't designed for something this heavy. Not even close. Yet Walter never hurried. He simply positioned heavy logging chains exactly where they needed to go. Then he looked toward Daniel. Power isn't always about size. The rain stopped. The evening became strangely quiet. Emily wrapped one end of the chain around the truck's front axle. Walter engaged first gear. The chain tightened. Nothing moved. For one long second. Everyone thought Daniel had been right. Then the old tractor dug its rear tires into the wet Wisconsin soil. The engine didn't roar. It settled into a deep, steady pull. The chain groaned. Mud shifted. The truck moved. An inch. Then another. No one spoke. Even Daniel forgot to breathe. And just as the truck climbed high enough for its front wheels to find solid ground, a sharp metallic crack echoed across the road. The sound of metal snapping echoed across the ditch, and every person standing along the roadside froze. Emily felt her heart sink. Richard Coleman took 2 quick steps forward. Daniel Brooks muttered, "The chain." Walter, however, never climbed down from the Farmel. He eased the clutch back in. The tractor stopped. No panic. No shouting. He looked over his shoulder and smiled. It wasn't the chain. Everyone hurried closer. One of the worn towing hooks on the stranded truck had broken away from years of hidden rust. The logging chain itself remained intact. Walter climbed down, brushed the mud from his gloves, and walked around the truck one slow step at a time. Finally, he pointed beneath the frame. There's your answer. A heavy recovery point sat just behind the front axle. It had been there all along. The county crew quickly repositioned the chain. Walter climbed back onto the old tractor. This time, no one laughed. Richard removed his hat. Daniel stood silently beside him. The Farmel settled into its familiar rhythm. The rear tires bit into the damp Wisconsin clay. The engine pulled steadily, never racing, never straining beyond what Walter asked of it. The truck rose from the ditch one careful foot at a time. Then another. Within less than 2 minutes, all 4 wheels rested on solid gravel. For several seconds, Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the slow idle of a tractor that had already proven everything it needed to prove. Daniel finally walked toward Walter. Months earlier, he had laughed in front of an entire feed store. Now he extended his hand. "I owe you an apology." Walter accepted it without hesitation. "You don't owe me one," he said quietly. "You owe yourself the chance to keep learning." Daniel smiled. "I think I finally understand." Walter nodded. "Good." That single word carried more kindness than 100 speeches. The partnership continued to grow throughout the rest of the decade. By 1988, dozens of dairy and beef operations across Dodge County were receiving scheduled deliveries of brewery grain coordinated by Emily's handwritten ledgers. What had started with one fence line became a cooperative effort that helped neighboring farms lower feed costs while reducing waste from local industry. Emily eventually studied agricultural business at the state university, but she returned home after graduation. People assumed she would leave the farm forever. She never intended to. Instead, she expanded the family operation, adding grain storage, feed consulting, and transportation services, while keeping her grandfather's simple rule at the center of every decision. If something still has value, treat it that way. Richard Coleman remained with the brewery for many years. Whenever new managers questioned the partnership, he drove them to the Jensen farm. He never began with spreadsheets. He began with a story about an old man who saw opportunity where everyone else saw garbage. Daniel Brooks changed too. His consulting business became known for helping farmers reduce unnecessary costs instead of simply encouraging them to spend more. Whenever young consultants asked where he had learned that lesson, he smiled. From the farmer I laughed at. He never tried to hide the story. He believed it deserved to be told exactly as it happened. Let me tell you about Walter's final harvest. He was 79 years old. His hands shook a little more than they once had. His steps were slower. But every morning, he still walked the machinery shed before sunrise. He would rest one hand on the faded hood of the Farmel Super M for a moment before starting the day's work. Not because the tractor needed him, because old habits become a kind of gratitude. Walter passed away peacefully several winters later with his family close by. The farm stayed in the family. Emily continued running it with the same quiet discipline she had learned beside her grandfather. Visitors often noticed the old Farmel Park near the entrance during community farm days. Many assumed it was only for display. Then Emily would turn the key. The familiar four-cylinder engine would come to life. Children would smile. Older farmers would nod. And those who knew its story understood they weren't listening to an old machine. They were listening to a lifetime of careful work. Some people measure wealth by what they own. Walter measured it by what they could pass on. The grain trucks eventually became newer. The roads improved. The paperwork moved from notebooks to computers. But the lesson never changed. Waste is often just value waiting for someone patient enough to recognize it. Some things don't become priceless because they're rare. They become priceless because someone cared for them long enough to reveal what everyone else overlooked. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly solved problems while others laughed, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or a friend who taught you that steady work outlasts loud opinions. Stories like those deserve to be remembered. And next time, I'll share another tale of rural ingenuity, about a forgotten piece of farm equipment that everyone believed had reached the end of its life, until one quiet farmer proved otherwise.